November 17th, 1864. The Maritime courtroom in Boston Harbor falls silent as a brass cage is carried to the witness stand. Inside, a scarlet macaw shifts on its perch, fixing one yellow eye on the defendant, Captain Edmund Harrow of the merchant vessel the DERRY Rose. When the magistrate opens the cage door, the bird speaks in a voice that makes 12 jurors go pale. Pushed him over. Pushed him over. God forgive me. God forgive me. The parrot belongs to the missing First Mate James Wickham, last seen alive 43 days earlier 300 miles from shore. Captain Harrow insists Wickham fell during a storm, but the bird won't stop talking. And what it reveals, word by damning word, will expose a conspiracy of murder, mutiny, and madness that reaches from the captain's quarters to the ship's hold, where something unspeakable has been hidden beneath the cargo of Virginia tobacco. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple confession. Before we uncover the truth about the DERRY sailor's parrot, and how a bird's testimony led to one of maritime history's most disturbing trials, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back to 1864, when America was bleeding through its Civil War, and the high seas held secrets deeper than any battlefield grave. The autumn of 1864 found the United States locked in the 4th year of its Civil War. While battles raged at Cedar Creek and Franklin, a different kind of warfare played out on the Atlantic, one of commerce, blockade running, and desperate profit-seeking. Merchant vessels sailing under Union flags commanded premium rates for goods from Europe, and captains willing to brave Confederate raiders could make a fortune in a single voyage. The port of Boston bustled with this gray market trade. Along the wharves of Atlantic Avenue, ship owners recruited crews from the dregs of waterfront taverns, men fleeing conscription, Irish immigrants escaping famine's long shadow, and sailors who asked no questions about cargo or destination. The maritime courts, overwhelmed with piracy cases and blockade violations, had little time for investigating the occasional man-overboard incident that plagued these voyages. Into this world sailed the DERRY Rose, a 3-masted merchant bark built in the shipyards of Portsmouth in 1851. She was 142 feet of oaken canvas, designed to carry tobacco, cotton, and rum between Virginia ports and European markets. Her captain, Edmund Harrow, was a man of 43 years, stern-faced and scripture-quoting, known among Boston's shipping agents as reliable if humorless. He wore his Presbyterian faith-like armor and kept a Bible in his cabin alongside his charts and sextant. Harrow's first mate was James Wickham, 31 years old, a contrast in every way. Where Harrow was rigid, Wickham was jovial. Where the captain rarely smiled, the first mate laughed easily with the crew. Wickham had served under Harrow for 3 years across a dozen voyages, and by all accounts they maintained professional respect despite their different temperaments. But Wickham had one peculiarity that drew attention at every port, his scarlet macaw, a magnificent bird he'd purchased in Havana in 1861. The parrot, which Wickham named Prophet, possessed an unsettling talent for mimicry. The bird could reproduce not just words but the exact cadence and tone of human voices. Sailors swore they'd heard Prophet imitate Captain Harrow's prayer voice, Wickham's laughter, even the screams of men who'd fallen from the rigging. "That bird knows too much," the ship's cook, a Portuguese man named Costa, was recorded saying in August 1864. "He hears things in the dark, repeats what should stay secret." On September 3, 1864, the DERRY Rose departed Boston Harbor with a crew of 18 men, bound for Liverpool with a cargo of Virginia tobacco, valuable in war-rationed Britain. The voyage should have taken 28 days. Fair winds were forecast, the crew was experienced, everything appeared routine, but 3 sailors refused to board at the last moment, forfeiting their advance pay. When questioned by the harbor master, one, a Swedish rigger named Carlson, would only say, "Something's wrong with that ship." The way the captain looks at Wickham, like he's seeing a dead man. The harbor master noted the comment but did nothing. Men had superstitions, ships sailed with bad feelings all the time. The DERRY Rose cleared the harbor at dawn, her sails filling with autumn wind. She would not return as the same vessel that departed. The first sign of trouble came on September 9th, 6 days into the voyage. The ship's log, maintained by Harrow himself, notes fair weather and good progress, 17 knots under full sail, position logged at 42 and 52. But what the log doesn't record is what the crew heard that night. According to later testimony from the ship's carpenter, Michael Dowd, voices erupted from the captain's cabin near midnight. Dowd was working below, repairing a beam near the stern, when he heard Captain Harrow and First Mate Wickham engaged in what he described as a fierce quarrel, unlike anything I'd witnessed between them before. The words were muffled by oak planking, but certain phrases carried clearly, Wickham saying something about, "Your wife deserves to know," and Harrow responding with, "You'll destroy everything I've built." The argument lasted approximately 20 minutes. Then silence. When Wickham emerged, Dowd reported, the first mate's face was white as canvas, and his hands shook as he climbed to the deck. Prophet, the parrot, had been in Wickham's cabin during the confrontation. The next morning the bird began repeating a phrase in what several crew members recognized as Captain Harrow's voice. "I'll see you dead first. I'll see you dead first." Wickham laughed it off when sailors mentioned it. "Prophet picks up everything," he said. Probably heard it from some tavern brawl in Boston, but the bird kept repeating it, for 3 days straight. On September 15th, the ship's night watch rotated, and second mate Thomas Brennan found himself on deck from midnight to 4 a.m., alongside ordinary seaman Patrick Quinn. In his later deposition, Brennan described seeing Captain Harrow emerge from below at approximately 2 a.m., which struck him as unusual. The captain typically slept until dawn unless weather threatened. Harrow stood at the stern rail for what Brennan estimated as 30 minutes, staring at the ship's wake. The moon was full that night, and Brennan could see the captain's profile clearly. He was talking to himself, Brennan testified, or praying. His lips moved constantly, and once I heard him say, "Forgive me, Lord, for what I'm about to do." When Brennan approached to ask if the captain needed anything, Harrow spun around with such violence I thought he might strike me. The captain's eyes, Brennan said, looked fevered, wild, not like himself at all. Harrow demanded to know where First Mate Wickham was sleeping. When Brennan confirmed Wickham was in his cabin, Harrow nodded and returned below. But he didn't go to his own quarters. Brennan watched him pause outside Wickham's door for a full minute before finally retreating. The next morning, Wickham found his cabin door's lock had been tampered with. Scratches surrounded the keyhole, as if someone had attempted to pick it during the night. Prophet began a new phrase that day, delivered in Wickham's voice. "He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me." The crew assumed the bird was repeating something Wickham had said in jest or in his sleep. On September 28th, the DERRY Rose encountered a North Atlantic storm. The ship's log records winds of 40 knots and waves reaching 20 ft. Dangerous but not catastrophic for a vessel of her size and an experienced crew. Standard procedure required reducing sail and maintaining course, riding out the storm's fury. But Captain Harrow gave unusual orders. Instead of heaving to and weathering the storm, he commanded the ship to turn northwest, away from Liverpool and deeper into the Atlantic's most treacherous waters. When second mate Brennan questioned the decision, Harrow dismissed him from the deck. The crew worked in confusion, following orders that seemed designed to maximize danger. For 6 hours, the DERRY Rose pitched and rolled through conditions that grew worse rather than better. 2 sailors were injured, one with a broken arm from a swinging boom, another with a head wound from being thrown against the mast. First Mate Wickham argued openly with the captain on the quarterdeck. "You're going to kill us all." Several sailors heard him shout above the wind. "This is madness, Edmund." Harrow's response was recorded by 3 different witnesses. "If God wills this ship to sink, then we sink. I'll not question his judgment." But the storm wasn't the strangest part. Multiple crew members reported that during the worst of the gale they heard Prophet shrieking from Wickham's cabin. Not the usual parrot sounds, but a prolonged, almost human scream that cut through the wind. When the storm finally passed near dawn, the bird had torn out several of its own feathers and bloodied its beak against the cage bars. The ship's cook, Costa, later testified, "That bird knew something bad was coming. Animals sense death before it arrives. Prophet was trying to warn us." October 5, 1864, the night that transformed a troubled voyage into a murder investigation. The ship's log, in Captain Harrow's handwriting, states simply, "First Mate James Wickham lost overboard during night watch. Rough seas prevented recovery. Position 47N31W. Body committed to the deep with prayer. God rest his soul." But the ship's carpenter Michael Dowd told a different story. Dowd couldn't sleep that night. The injury to his hand from the storm still pained him. At approximately 3 a.m. he came on deck for fresh air. The sea was calm, stars visible, wind gentle. Not the rough seas Harrow would later claim. He saw 2 figures at the stern rail, Captain Harrow and First Mate Wickham. They stood close together, speaking in low voices Dowd couldn't make out. Then, as Dowd watched from the shadows near the mainmast, Something happened that he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. The captain's hands shot out, Dowd testified. He grabbed Mr. Wickham by the shoulders. There was a brief struggle. I heard Wickham cry out, "Edmund, no," and then both men lurched against the rail. One moment Wickham was there, the next he was gone, just gone, over the side without even a splash I could hear. Dowd stood frozen, unable to process what he'd witnessed. Captain Harrow remained at the rail for perhaps 30 seconds, breathing hard, before he straightened his coat and turned around, directly facing where Dowd hid in the shadows. "Mr. Dowd," Harrow said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "you saw First Mate Wickham fall, a terrible accident in rough seas. You'll testify to that when we reach port." It wasn't a question. It was a command. Dowd, paralyzed with fear, nodded, but Harrow had forgotten about profit. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. The next part of this investigation gets even more disturbing as we discover what the Parrot revealed and how a bird's testimony would challenge everything Victorian society believed about justice and truth. Let's discover what happens next. When the DERRY Rose limped into Boston Harbor on November 9, 1864, 12 days overdue, harbor officials immediately noticed something wrong. The ship sailed sluggishly, her sails poorly trimmed, her deck unusually quiet. Capped high. And Harrow stood alone at the helm, his face gaunt and unshaven, eyes sunken in his skull like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. The crew disembarked in unusual silence. No laughter. No relief at reaching land. They moved like ghosts, avoiding eye contact with the captain and with each other. The harbor master, Samuel Pritchard, recorded his first impression. The men of the DERRY Rose carried the look of witnesses to something unholy. They did not seem glad to be home. Captain Harrow reported First Mate Wickham's death as a tragic accident during rough seas. He presented the ship's log as documentation. The pages were perfectly maintained. Coordinates, weather conditions, cargo status all meticulously recorded. The entry for October 5th described a sudden squall, 30-foot waves. Wickham swept overboard while securing a loose sail. Standard maritime tragedy. It should have ended there. Sailors died at sea regularly. The war between the states had killed hundreds of thousands. One more casualty barely registered in the public consciousness. But then Michael Dowd went to the maritime authorities. On November 12th, 3 days after the ship's return, Dowd appeared at the office of Maritime Inspector Charles Halford, with a cage containing Prophet, the scarlet macaw. Dowd was trembling, clearly terrified, but determined to speak. "The captain murdered Mr. Wickham," Dowd said. "I saw it, and the bird knows it too." Inspector Halford was skeptical. The notion of a parrot as witness seemed absurd, but Dowd's fear was genuine, and certain details of his account troubled Halford, particularly Dowd's description of calm seas on the night Wickham supposedly washed overboard. Halford agreed to investigate. What authorities discovered next would challenge the very foundations of courtroom procedure and Victorian scientific understanding. When Halford brought Prophet to his office and began documenting what the bird said, he encountered something that defied rational explanation. The parrot didn't just repeat random phrases, it delivered a coherent narrative in 3 distinct voices. In Captain Harrow's voice, harsh and commanding. "You'll tell no one about Mary. You'll take this secret to your grave." In First Mate Wickham's voice, pleading, "She deserves to know the child isn't yours. She deserves the truth." Then Harrow's voice again. Pushed him over, "God forgive me, God forgive me." And most chillingly in Wickham's voice, fading, desperate, "Edmund, no, please, I can't swim. Edmund." Halford spent 6 hours with that bird documenting everything it said. He brought in a stenographer to create a written record. He invited other officials to witness Prophet's statements. Each time, the bird repeated the same phrases in the same voices, a loop of confession playing over and over. But testimony from a parrot couldn't hold up in court. Or could it? Halford ordered the DERRY Rose impounded and launched a comprehensive investigation. He interviewed every crew member separately, forbidding them from speaking to each other. And as men were isolated from the captain's influence, they began to talk. Second Mate Thomas Brennan admitted he'd seen Harrow tampering with Wickham's cabin door. Seaman Patrick Quinn revealed that Harrow had offered him $50 to swear he'd witnessed Wickham fall during a storm, even though Quinn had been below deck sleeping at the time. The ship's cook, Costa, described how Harrow had forbidden anyone from entering Wickham's cabin after his death, claiming he needed to secure the first mate's personal effects. But it was the ship's surgeon, Dr. Leonard Mills, who provided the most damning evidence. Mills had maintained a private journal, not part of the official ship's log, In it, he documented his growing alarm at Captain Harrow's behavior. Mills wrote of the captain's nervous agitation, his obsessive references to sin and damnation, and most significantly, his repeated mentions of Mary Harrow, the captain's wife. When investigators traveled to the Harrow residence in Beacon Hill, they found a woman living in ignorant contentment, pregnant with her third child. She knew nothing of her husband's troubles at sea. But when questioned about First Mate James Wickham, her face revealed something she couldn't hide. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Mary Harrow admitted to a brief affair with Wickham 2 years earlier, during one of her husband's long voyages. The affair had lasted only weeks, ending when guilt overwhelmed her. She'd confessed to a priest but never to her husband, and she'd certainly never told Edmund that her second child, a boy named Jonathan, now 18 months old, had been fathered by Wickham, not by him. But Wickham knew, and Wickham, racked by conscience, had decided Edmund Harrow deserved to know the truth. The argument in the captain's cabin on September 9th, Wickham confessing the affair and the child's true parentage. The captain's midnight vigil on September 15th, Harrow wrestling with whether to confront his wife or eliminate the problem at its source. The dangerous storm course on September 28th, a first abandoned attempt at making Wickham's death look accidental, and October 5th, under calm stars and gentle seas. The moment Edmund Harrow made his choice, Inspector Halford obtained a warrant to search the DERRY Rose more thoroughly. In the cargo hold, beneath crates of Virginia tobacco, investigators found something that turned their stomachs. A makeshift compartment containing Wickham's sea chest, his navigational instruments, and his journal. All things that should have been sent to his family but instead had been hidden. The journal's final entry, dated October 4th, 1 day before Wickham's death, read, "Captain Harrow barely speaks to me. When he looks at me, I see murder in his eyes. The crew senses something terrible coming. Prophet won't stop screaming. If something happens to me, let it be known. I fear Edmund Harrow means me harm. I cannot swim. If I go overboard, it will be no accident." The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Motive: Wickham had fathered Harrow's child and threatened to reveal it. Opportunity: captain and first mate alone at the stern rail. Means: a simple push. And now, impossibly, a confession, spoken not by the killer, but by a scarlet macaw who'd witnessed something humans were never meant to see. On November 17, 1864, Captain Edmund Harrow was arrested and charged with murder on the high seas. The trial of Captain Edmund Harrow began on January 14, 1865, in the Federal Maritime Court of Boston. It would become one of the most controversial legal proceedings in American history, not because of the murder itself, but because of the question that dominated the courtroom. Could a Parrot's testimony be admitted as evidence? Prosecutor James Whitfield, a formidable attorney known for his work on piracy cases, faced an unprecedented challenge. He had circumstantial evidence, witness statements, and Wickham's prophetic journal entry, but the confession, the most damaging evidence, came from a bird. Whitfield's legal argument was ingenious. He didn't claim Prophet was a witness in the traditional sense. Instead, he argued the parrot was a recording device, no different than a written document or a phonograph cylinder. The bird had mechanically captured and preserved Captain Harrow's own words, spoken in the privacy of his cabin when he believed no one was listening. "This parrot is not testifying," Whitfield told the court. "Captain Harrow is testifying. The bird is merely the medium through which his confession is preserved and presented." Defense attorney Cornelius Blackwood countered that accepting a parrot's mimicry as evidence would set a dangerous precedent. "What's next?" he asked the jury. "Will we convict men based on echoes, on the rustling of leaves, that sound like whispered confessions? My client has the right to face his accuser, and a bird cannot be cross-examined." Judge Nathaniel Harding, a stern 63-year-old veteran of maritime law, allowed the prosecution to present Prophet in court as documentary evidence. The parrot would not be sworn in, it would not take the witness stand, but the jury would be permitted to hear what it said. On January 22nd, Prophet was brought into the courtroom in his brass cage. The gallery, packed with spectators, fell silent as the cage was opened. For 5 terrible minutes, the bird said nothing. Prosecutor Whitfield coaxed it with familiar phrases. The stenographer stood ready. The jury leaned forward in their seats. Then, in perfect mimicry of Captain Harrow's voice, a voice several jury members had heard during the trial, Prophet spoke. "Pushed him over. God forgive me. Pushed him over." 3 women in the gallery fainted. 2 jurors audibly gasped. Captain Harrow, sitting at the defense table, turned white and gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles cracked. "That's not me," Harrow whispered. "That's not my voice." But it was. Everyone in the courtroom recognized it. Defense attorney Blackwood fought viciously to have Prophet's statement stricken from the record. He called expert witnesses, ornithologists from Harvard who testified that parrots mimic sounds, without understanding context, that the bird could have learned these phrases anywhere, that there was no proof Prophet had witnessed anything on the night of October 5th. The prosecution countered by calling Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a naturalist who'd studied avian cognition. Dr. Cartwright testified that while parrots don't understand human language, they do associate sounds with emotional contexts. "This bird witnessed a traumatic event," Dr. Cartwright said. "The phrases it repeats are linked to that trauma. This is not random mimicry. This is the bird processing what it experienced." But the trial's most dramatic moment came when Prosecutor Whitfield called Michael Dowd to the stand. Dowd, the ship's carpenter, had been reluctant to testify. He'd received anonymous threats, notes slipped under his door warning him to keep silent. His wife begged him to recant his story. But on January 28th he took the stand and, with his voice shaking, described exactly what he'd seen on the night of October 5th. "I watched Captain Harrow grab Mr. Wickham," Dowd testified. "I watched him push. I heard Mr. Wickham cry out for help, and I did nothing. God help me, I did nothing." Defense attorney Blackwood cross-examined mercilessly. He suggested Dowd's testimony was motivated by the $500 reward offered by Wickham's family. He pointed out inconsistencies in Dowd's initial statements to authorities. He implied Dowd himself might have been involved in Wickham's death and was now attempting to shift blame. "Did anyone else see what you claim to have witnessed?" Blackwood demanded. "No, sir," Dowd admitted. "So we have only your word, the word of a man who admits he stood by while murder occurred, and the supposed testimony of a bird." "Yes, sir, that's all we have, but it's the truth." The prosecution also revealed Mary Harrow's affair and the paternity of her son. This devastated Mary, who appeared in court pale and shaking, forced to admit her infidelity in front of hundreds of spectators and newspaper reporters. She confirmed that Wickham was Jonathan's father, and that Wickham had expressed intention to tell her husband. "Did you want James Wickham dead?" Blackwood asked her. "No," Mary whispered. "I wanted the past to stay buried, but I never wished him harm." "And your husband, when he discovered the truth about your son's parentage, how did he react?" Mary began to weep. "I don't know. James said he was going to tell Edmund on their next voyage. I begged him not to, but James said Edmund deserved to know. He said lying made him sick." The jury heard all of this, the motive, the opportunity, the timeline. But the question remained, was the evidence sufficient to convict? Captain Harrow finally took the stand in his own defense on February 3rd. He maintained his innocence with the rigid certainty of the deeply religious. James Wickham was swept overboard during a squall, he testified. "I tried to save him, I threw a rope, but the sea took him. This is God's honest truth." When asked about the phrases Prophet repeated, Harrow claimed the bird must have learned them from other sources, perhaps from other sailors, perhaps from conversations taken out of context. "I prayed for forgiveness many times on that voyage," he said. "I am a sinner like all men, but I did not murder James Wickham." The prosecution confronted him with his own ship's log. "You recorded rough seas on October 5th, but 4 crew members testified the ocean was calm that night. How do you explain this discrepancy?" "Memory can be unreliable," Harrow said. "It was dark, perhaps I was mistaken about conditions, or perhaps you lied in your log to justify a murder you just committed." "I am not a liar, sir, I am a Christian." Prosecutor Whitfield's final question cut to the heart of the matter. "Captain Harrow, did you know that James Wickham was the biological father of your son Jonathan?" The courtroom held its breath. Harrow's face contorted. Rage, grief, humiliation all playing across his features. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "I suspected, but I chose to believe my wife. I chose faith over suspicion, until James Wickham forced you to confront the truth. I did not kill James Wickham." But his eyes told a different story. The trial concluded on February 10th, 1865. Closing arguments took an entire day. Defense attorney Blackwood reminded the jury that American justice required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and that a parrot's mimicry, however unsettling, could not constitute such proof. "Will you send a man to the gallows based on the sounds made by a bird?" he asked. Prosecutor Whitfield's closing was equally powerful. "This case is not about a parrot, it's about a premeditated murder, witnessed by one man who was too terrified to speak until his conscience overwhelmed him, and preserved in the voice of a creature who innocently recorded what he heard. Captain Harrow's own words convict him. not the bird's testimony, his own confession, spoken in a moment when he believed only God was listening. The jury deliberated for 16 hours. On February 12, 1865, they returned with a verdict, guilty of murder on the high seas. Captain Edmund Harrow was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was never carried out. Harrow's attorneys appealed to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, arguing that the admission of Prophet's statements violated the defendant's constitutional rights. The case, Commonwealth v. Harrow, created legal precedent that exists to this day. The court ruled that while Prophet's mimicry was admissible as evidence, it could not be the sole basis for conviction. However, when combined with Dowd's eyewitness testimony, Wickham's journal, and the established motive, the conviction was upheld. While the appeal was pending, Harrow fell ill in prison. The conditions in the Suffolk County Jail were harsh, and Harrow, a man who'd spent his life at sea, deteriorated rapidly in confinement. He developed pneumonia in March 1865 and died on April 3rd, before his execution could be scheduled. His final words, recorded by the prison chaplain, were, "Tell Mary I forgive her, and tell James I'm sorry." Mary Harrow never remarried. She lived in seclusion in a small house in Roxbury, raising her 3 children, including Jonathan, who would grow up never knowing his biological father. She died in 1889, reportedly still wearing her wedding ring. Michael Dowd, the carpenter whose testimony had been crucial to the conviction, left maritime service. He became a teacher in Vermont and spent his final years campaigning for crew protections and better reporting procedures for deaths at sea. He died in 1901, carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed for 36 years. And Prophet, the scarlet macaw who'd changed legal history? The court initially planned to release the bird to Wickham's family, but they declined, finding the parrot too disturbing. Inspector Charles Halford adopted Prophet and kept him until the bird's death in 1881, an unusually long life for a macaw. According to Halford's journals, Prophet never learned new phrases after the trial. For 17 years, the bird repeated the same terrible loop, Wickham's pleas, Harrow's confession, over and over, a recording that could never be erased. "Sometimes I wonder if the bird is cursed," Halford wrote in 1879. "To remember only that one terrible night, to speak only of murder, what kind of existence is that?" When Prophet died, Halford had the bird preserved by a taxidermist. The mounted macaw was donated to Harvard's Natural History Museum, where it remained on display until 1923, when the museum's director, disturbed by the specimen's dark history, had it removed to storage. Prophet's preserved body remains in Harvard's collections today, tucked away in a basement archive, silent at last. The case of Commonwealth v. Harrow sent shockwaves through both legal and scientific communities. It raised questions that Victorian society was ill-equipped to answer. Could animals be witnesses? Where was the line between evidence and superstition? And what did it mean for human justice when the only witness to murder was a creature with no understanding of truth or lies? The immediate legal impact was significant. Massachusetts maritime law was reformed to require multiple witnesses to any incident involving crew deaths at sea. Captains could no longer file simple accident reports. Every man overboard incident now triggered an automatic investigation involving sworn statements from at least 3 crew members. Insurance companies, seeing an opportunity, began requiring ships to carry independent observers on long voyages. This led to the development of the supercargo position, an officer whose job was specifically to document and verify the captain's decisions and report any irregularities. But the broader implications went far beyond maritime law. The Harrow case became a touchstone for debates about evidence and testimony that continue today. Legal scholars still cite Commonwealth v. Harrow when discussing the admissibility of non-traditional evidence, from early phonograph recordings to modern digital surveillance. The core question remains unchanged. If technology or circumstance allows us to capture someone's words in an unexpected way, should those words be used against them in court? The case also revealed deep truths about Victorian society's understanding of guilt, confession, and surveillance. Captain Harrow believed his cabin was a private space where he could speak freely, processing his guilt through prayer and self-reflection. The idea that a parrot might be listening and remembering never occurred to him. This speaks to a broader anxiety that emerged in the late 19th century as technology began enabling new forms of recording and observation. The phonograph, invented by Edison in 1877, made people realize that sounds could be captured and preserved indefinitely. The camera was creating permanent visual records of moments that would otherwise be fleeting. And now, a Parrot had demonstrated that even in the absence of mechanical recording devices, words could be preserved and later used as evidence. Privacy, Victorian society began to realize, was becoming a much more complicated concept. The Harrow case also forced people to confront the reality that murder could happen anywhere, even in places that seemed governed by strict hierarchies and codes of honor. The merchant marine had always operated with an almost feudal structure, where the captain's word was absolute law. Questioning a captain's decisions was tantamount to mutiny, but Harrow's crime demonstrated that this absolute authority could facilitate absolute evil. If a captain decided to murder his first mate, who would stop him? Who would question him? The crew's reluctance to come forward, even after witnessing murder, revealed how power dynamics could enable atrocity. In the years following the trial, similar cases emerged that had been previously dismissed or ignored. In 1867, the captain of the merchant vessel Sally Bright was convicted of murdering his second mate after crew members finally felt empowered to testify against superior officers. In 1870, a Rio de Janeiro-bound ship returned to Boston with 3 crew members missing, and for the first time, authorities refused to accept the captain's accident explanation without thorough investigation. The Harrow case became a catalyst for the broader sailors' rights movement that gained momentum in the 1870s and 1880s. Organizations like the American Seamen's Friends Society used the case to argue for better legal protections for crew members and independent oversight of captain's authority. Psychologically, the case also fascinated the emerging field of criminal psychology. Harrow represented a particular type of killer, the religious, outwardly moral man who commits murder to preserve his reputation and family structure. His crime was not passionate or impulsive. It was calculated, cold-blooded, wrapped in prayer and righteousness. Dr. Henry Maudsley, a prominent British psychiatrist, wrote about the Harrow case in his 1874 book Responsibility and Mental Disease. Maudsley argued that Harrow's religious mania had created a psychological framework where murder could be rationalized as divine will. Captain Harrow convinced himself that eliminating Wickham was God's judgment, not his own murderous intent. This allowed him to commit the act while maintaining his self-image as a righteous man. This psychological profile, the killer who cannot admit his own evil, would become tragically familiar in later criminal cases. Harrow was a prototype for understanding how normal-seeming people commit extraordinary violence. Perhaps most hauntingly, the case raised questions about witness and memory that resonate deeply today. Prophet the Parrot didn't understand the words he repeated. He didn't know he was testifying to murder. He was simply mimicking sounds that had made a strong impression on his small brain. Yet his testimony was more reliable than many human witnesses would have been. He couldn't be intimidated, he couldn't be bribed, he couldn't misremember or reinterpret. He simply repeated what he'd heard, again and again, a recording untainted by human bias or fear. This raised an uncomfortable question. Are human witnesses reliable? If a parrot's mimicry is more consistent than human memory, what does that say about our justice system's reliance on eyewitness testimony? Modern neuroscience has confirmed what the Harrow case hinted at. Human memory is profoundly unreliable, influenced by emotion, suggestion, and time. We don't remember events. We remember our last memory of events, each recollection subtly altering the record. Prophet, in his own way, was the most honest witness in the courtroom. He didn't understand truth or lies. He simply repeated what he'd heard, no more and no less. The case also had a cultural impact that extended into literature and popular consciousness. Herman Melville, though he'd stopped writing novels by 1864, followed the Harrow trial closely and mentioned it in letters to friends. The theme of a captain's absolute power leading to murder echoed his own work, particularly Benito Cereno and the tyrannical Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. Edgar Allan Poe had died in 1849, but his story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, featuring an orangutan as the unexpected perpetrator, was often compared to the Harrow case. Both involved animals becoming central to murder investigations in ways that challenged human assumptions about crime and evidence. The case became the subject of penny dreadfuls, sensationalist newspaper serials, and eventually stage plays. A melodrama titled The Parrot's Confession toured New England theaters in 1867, turning the tragedy into Gothic entertainment. But perhaps the deepest implication of the Harrow case is what it reveals about silence and complicity. Michael Dowd witnessed murder and said nothing for weeks. Other crew members suspected something terrible had happened but convinced themselves it wasn't their place to question the captain. Everyone stayed silent, until a parrot spoke. How many other murders have been facilitated by similar silence? How many crimes go unpunished because witnesses lack the courage to come forward? The Harrow case suggests that sometimes truth requires an unlikely voice, someone or something without a stake in the social order, unburdened by fear or loyalty. Prophet the Parrot became that voice, not through bravery or moral conviction, but through simple, mechanical repetition of what he'd heard. In the end, Edmund Harrow was undone not by sophisticated detective work or forensic science, but by his own words, preserved and repeated by a creature who didn't understand them. It's a reminder that in seeking justice, sometimes the most powerful evidence is a confession, even when that confession is delivered by the most unexpected witness imaginable. What do you think drove Captain Edmund Harrow to murder? Was it wounded pride, religious mania, or the desperate need to preserve his family's facade of normalcy? Could James Wickham have handled the revelation differently, or was tragedy inevitable once he decided to confess? And here's the question that still haunts legal scholars. Should Prophet's testimony have been admissible in court? Did a parrot's mimicry constitute real evidence, or did the trial set a dangerous precedent? Leave your theories in the comments below. This community always brings fascinating perspectives on these dark chapters of history. If you want to explore more forgotten cases where justice came from unexpected places, subscribe to The Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're always uncovering stories history tried to bury. Next week, we're investigating the 1871 case of the Chicago widow whose photographs revealed a murder and exposed one of the city's most powerful families. Until then, remember, sometimes the truth speaks in the voices we least expect. See you in the next video.